Welcome to NABA Perspectives, a podcast by the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, where we look at key trends, issues, and stories that are driving economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Lanre, the head of content at NABA, and this week we're speaking with Alex Vines. He's the research director and the director of the Africa program at Chatham House. And we talk about the significance and implications of the announcement by Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali that they intend to leave ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. What are the political implications? What are the security implications? And what are the geopolitical implications? Alex, welcome to NABA Perspectives. Thanks so much for joining the podcast. Pleasure to have you on.
You're very welcome. Good to see you after this time.
Indeed, likewise. So we've had this rather dramatic announcement from Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali on the 28th of January that they had decided to, with immediate effect, in their words, quit ECOWAS, which is, of course, the Economic Community of West African States. And they went even further and accused ECOWAS of having fallen under the influence of foreign powers and representing a threat to its own member states. So quite dramatic language, quite a dramatic announcement. Let's start there. How serious an announcement is this? What are some of the potential implications? What's your sort of initial take on this development?
Look, this is politics. They had already last year announced that they were creating a union of Sahel states, all three of them, and that they had a long-term ambition to have their own currency called the Sahel. So that was already an indication that they were considering to make some gesture like this. The timing of this, I think, is not coincidental. I think it's to do with anxiety about what ECOWAS was doing, but also what France was doing. There's been high-level traffic to Paris in the recent past, including the first visit for decades of the Chief of Army Staff of Algeria, but also, as you know, President Tinubu of Nigeria has visited Paris, and President Ouattara of Cote d'Ivoire. And so these juntas, I think, all three of them, pretty anxious about what that meant. And the one thing they have in common is that they all don't want to go to elections anytime soon, which is the key ask from ECOWAS, which is that they're putschists and they need to agree to a timetable to return to constitutional rule, including an election. And as you know, Mali has kept postponing elections. It's now over 4 years since they've been promising elections. Burkina Faso is following the same route, and we're seeing this now increasingly with Niger. The reality is men in uniform, once they get into that presidential palace and seat, they start to become more politician than military.
You started by saying this is politics, and there's been some discussion around whether or not this is actually going to happen. So they've said we are withdrawing with immediate effect, but according to the rules of ECOWAS, it takes at least a year to actually withdraw. So is this, are we potentially looking at a political move here to try and negotiate some sort of settlement with ECOWAS? Because now effectively we've got 12 months where presumably there's going to be lots of talks going on here.
Yeah, look, I'm a bit surprised that Niger wanted to tie themselves so closely up to the juntas in Ouagadougou and in Bamako, to be honest with you. The roots of that particular coup are a bit different, and the politics is different, including the impact of ECOWAS sanctions on Niger are very, are putting immense pressure on Niger, as you can imagine, the Nigerian border being disrupted with Niger and so on. So you're absolutely right. They haven't deposited an official letter to say that they're leaving, and that would take a year. You and I live in the United Kingdom, Lanre. We remember how disruptive Brexit was and all that politics around that.
And still is.
And this, this isn't even this is not like the Brexit experience in the United Kingdom. And I don't think, for example, if you pull out of ECOWAS, well, you don't have freedom of movement. you start to need visas. All of these sorts of things are going to be really disruptive. And it is interesting that Mali has already said, well, they're not pulling out of the currency. So they are still going to be part of the West African Monetary Union. Imagine, Lanry, that's underpinned by the euro and the French Treasury in particular. And so the rhetoric of Mali about being, quintessentially 100% anti-French, yet they're saying, no, we need this currency that is backed out of Paris. So there are some very interesting contradictions. And my reading of this is that the timing was political because of anxiety of some of the action that France, but also ECOWAS are doing, Ouattara, Tinubu, the Algerians and their mediation, which had made some progress for sure in Niger in particular. And going back to this issue that, these men in uniform are in no hurry to return to constitutional rule. And that's a shame of it because, this will impact economies, and none of these juntas are doing too well on the popular support that they got originally from, which was improved security. The situation in Mali is incredibly alarming, and the security partners that the Malian junta have brought in are not delivering the type of security that people were hoping for. So the Russian offer is not improving security, and Burkina Faso also is struggling. And so again, I think we're going to start to see buyer's remorse where populations that actually did support coups because they felt that previous regimes weren't delivering security, international partners, including particularly the French, but it's also ECOWAS were not delivering security, and so then they needed a different route. And there's some good academic research done by the UNDP that shows that popular support for coups doesn't last because actually men in uniform don't have the sorts of answers that actually the populations are hoping for in the long term. So buyer's remorse becomes very pertinent.
Going back to this issue of, are they serious about this? Do you think this is a bluff? Are they trying to get to some sort of deal or agreement with the other ECOWAS states?
So, Lanre, this is where I'm puzzled because Niger is a bit different. It was more a palace coup. The head of the presidential guard was worried that he was going to get sacked. There were, elite politics in Niger, and it's grown into something else. But it wasn't a response in the same way to, very rapidly deteriorating security that we've seen in Mali and Burkina Faso. And then there is the spectre of counter coups. Yes, I think, Lanre, we could, consider that you and I might be talking later this year or in the future about a counter coup that's happened in Ouagadougou or in Bamako or possibly even in Niamey now. So it is about buying time, but the issue is that the Niger negotiations with Algerian good offices had progressed a lot further. The Algerians had not, for example, made much progress in Mali, and Burkina also has had the good offices of Togo in particular trying to kind of reach accommodation there. But the key issue has always been about timetable. Yeah, and you and I, I've got my grey hair now because I can remember, when ECOWAS was negotiating with previous putschists, some decades ago or even 10 years ago, and Niger was an example where there was a 1-year transition, and we're now talking about 4 or 5 years, which is a long time, which is the cycle of electoral cycles now. So this is quite different. The other difference from the past is that ECOWAS, particularly Nigeria, although it has President Tinubu as chair of ECOWAS at the moment, is much preoccupied with its domestic security and economic problems too. It is not able to extend its authority in the way that it did 20 years ago when I was stationed in Liberia. I mean, the Nigerians came in as a bridging operation for the ending the civil war in Liberia, for example, and very effectively so, very professional, and did a very effective job. That's less visible now, although there is, for example, a Nigerian deployment in Guinea-Bissau supporting ECOWAS at the moment.
That's part of the issue here is the strength of ECOWAS. We had the incident last year when there was the coup in Niger. There was very aggressive, very immediate talk about we are going to launch a military intervention. The military chiefs came out. They even dubbed it, D-Day. We've decided on D-Day, and then it just kind of evaporated. And one of the questions that's arisen now is the capacity within ECOWAS to actually respond to effectively, breakaway countries like Niger, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, to effectively respond to military coups in the region. And is there now a sense here that, well, what is ECOWAS going to do about this latest? Basically, I mean, it's kind of like, almost a provocation of saying, well, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, and look, were tensions in ECOWAS anyway about which was going down a linguistic, cleavage, which was the West African Monetary Union is francophone. Yes, I mean that's what it is. The West African franc, and the kind of and there had been over the last decade a sense that there was this tearing a little bit apart between the Anglophone ECOWAS and the Francophone ECOWAS. Which is why it's actually been very important that the President of Côte d'Ivoire, Mr. Ouattara, has been working very closely with Mr. Tinubu, because Ouattara and Tinubu do share analogy to putschists. They certainly have that in common. And ECOWAS good offices also contributed, I think, to the encouragement for the President of Senegal currently, Macky Sall, to conclude that actually 2 terms was enough and that he should look elsewhere, step down as president, look for an international career or do something else. So, there are some pluses, but it is shocking because when you talk about regional economic communities in Africa, honestly, Lanre, I've always thought ECOWAS was by far, the most robust and had the greatest potential. And when people were asking me about REX, which is the technical term, I would always think ECOWAS. Well, I look at ECOWAS now and I think, as a Brit, reminds me a little bit of the trauma of Brexit. And that's not something I personally would wish all my West African friends to go through, because I actually think working together and collectivism is the way to deal with globalization and global challenges, not to fragment in this way. So Nigeria and ECOWAS, they've unsurprisingly come out and they've been not at all impressed by this announcement. They've criticized it as actually undermining the economic interests and security interests of these states. But what will they do is the big question. Do we have any indication of what the response from ECOWAS might be here? Well, obviously, there is the technical issue of that you're meant to officially apply for, put a letter in, say, a year and that. And I do think that the juntas are going to have to think seriously if they want very bureaucratic, border restrictions on them by ECOWAS, I mean, we've got a president of one country that pulled away, but that was different. It wasn't a putschist regime, and that was Mauritania. Yep. So they pulled out saying, well, actually, Mauritania is a North African country and we don't feel affiliated to ECOWAS. And as you will remember, you've had other countries wanting to join ECOWAS, including Morocco, which also there was not consensus in ECOWAS about that. So there is politics about membership. I still am puzzled on how you will get a common position by the 3 putschist regimes, but maybe it's also just showing that the military junta in Niger now is developing a taste to retain power for much longer than we thought, because there was a real tug of war of ECOWAS arguing that the Niamey junta should have just a year And they were like, no, we want a lot longer than that. And this is where the bargaining was really getting down to. And I thought it was progressing until the last few weeks, when it seems to have really unraveled. I mean, the loser partly also in all of this is the ousted president of Niger, who is still in detention, and people forget about him, Mr. Bazoum. You know, a family member was released for kind of medical treatment, but Mr. Bazoum is still in detention.
In economic terms, ECOWAS is a big regional economic community, and these three states. I was doing a little bit of reading in preparation for this conversation, and I came across a statistic that said they account for just 8% of economic activity within ECOWAS. So, in economic terms, for the rest of the bloc, to put it, perhaps a bit insensitively, it won't be a big loss. But conversely, for Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, which are all landlocked countries, as you've already indicated, I mean, it seems like in terms of the economics of this, they have everything to lose and not much to gain.
Oh, Lanray, I mean, I'm sorry we go back to this. The Brexit thing was so much about emotion, yes, and politics, and the economics didn't really match up. And the sluggishness of the UK economy reminds me a bit of this. So, it is all about politics. This is not a rational decision, and yes, they can fly the gold out, the gold production, which is so important for the economies of Burkina Faso and Mali. That's the main thing. But cotton, cotton is going to be, real problem. Imagine you got all these tariffs and all these problems then to export your cotton, which is, really important for these, the southern tip of these Sahelian countries. And well, also obviously you can't fly out uranium production from Niger. So yes, I mean, again, I think the timing of this was politics because of suddenly the frenetic diplomatic activity. It was to build, more room for negotiation over transition timetable. I had never believed there would be presidential elections in Mali this year, and this just goes further to confirm they won't. Also, because the insecurity in Mali just is not conducive for elections. It's not just that the junta, is comfortable at just ruling the roost in Bamako, but it's technically very difficult to do that. And of course, you then have spoilers in all of this, as I would see them, the Russian Federation encouraging division. So, I mean, the African, if you look at the the second Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg last August, guess who were the main guests? They were putschist leaders who had been sanctioned by the African Union. And so you do have some double standards here. The Russians at the one level condemning people like Mr. Prigozhin of Wagner, the late Prigozhin, for doing what he was trying to do in Russia. And yet, then lauding, kind of military people, which was contrary to the spirit of the African Union, which says you should not engage putschists in this way in global, fora. So it's messy, and it is a reality of the multipolar world that we're in right at the moment.
And this is in many ways the big picture that looms over the situation in the Sahel. And there are two aspects of this that stand out to me and are pretty concerning in many ways. One is the security situation. Now, this has been deteriorating for over a decade. We had up until last year, I mean, there are still some vestiges of European and French presence in the Sahel, but that has kind of collapsed. We had a decade of a fairly significant French military presence stationed in the Sahel. That did nothing to stem the violence. So what we've seen this, the kind of the Islamist-linked violence in the Sahel go from strength to strength. And some might say, well, there is something to be said about the claims that are coming out of countries like Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso. It's like, we worked with you for 10 years. It didn't improve the situation whatsoever. Now, it's hard to see how quitting ECOWAS is going to in any way address that. If anything, this will make it even more difficult. I mean, what is the whole question of a response to insecurity in the Sahel seems to be just in limbo at the moment. Where, if at all, is this going?
Yeah, so, last year there was meant to be a report of a high-level panel that was commissioned by the UN Secretary General to exactly answer, well, what the hell to do about this? Everything else has failed. Is there any fresh new thinking on Sahel security? Unfortunately, the person that was leading that initiative is the former president of Niger, Mr. Issoufou, and there was a coup. And there have been allegations that he was maybe not completely innocent to some of the politics that's been going on in Niger. So that report has been dead and buried. And I'm afraid, I think even the Norwegian taxpayer will be disappointed, because quite a lot of Norwegian tax was going in to fund that initiative, if my memory is correct. So at the moment, it is all about how do you contain that there aren't more coups and what to do about it. And so you've got what are equivalent of, front line, kind of bolstering of coastal states now. And so, for example, the foreign minister of the United States, Blinken, has just been in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Cape Verde, and the Americans are looking at how they can maybe get another drone base access on a coastal state. The EU has opened a new envelope for bolstering coastal states, and so that's where we now see the new front line. And the French have footprint there and so on, in addition to Chad, which is not an ECOWAS country, as you know. So it's about containment, and the assumption is that there will be counter coups, that these, putschist regimes are very, very vulnerable, very fragile. It's also correct that that the investments of the last 20 years have not shown much success. Although I would argue myself, I think there is evidence that Niger actually was improving when the coup occurred in Niamey last year, that the security was actually improving, that there was more money coming in. But the reason for the Niger coup is that that President Bazoum comes from a very small minority and had a very brazen way of dealing with politics, and so had created a classic palace coup scenario which occurred, which was less driven about insecurity and some of the other issues which were key drivers in Mali and Burkina Faso, and those were definitely popular coups. I do think there's a degree of popularity with the Niger coup too, including that Bazoum was a minority and did not bring people along with him. But I remain not convinced that the popularity of these putschist regimes is continuing, and I think it's degrading because of the economic difficulties, and they haven't brought any better security than the failed French or ECOWAS or other interventions.
Now, and the economic pressure will certainly mount. Now, you mentioned the issue of bolstering coastal states, and that's been an aspect of the general instability in the Sahel that I feel has kind of been is underreported, and there's not enough awareness of the risk of spillover, let's call it that. And
Yeah.
I remember in late 2022 there was a meeting of ECOWAS states in Ghana, and there the Ghanaian president Nana Akufo-Addo, this was about the Sahel, he used some quite dramatic language where he said that if we're not careful, that the whole region could be consumed by this Islamist-linked violence that we've seen in the Sahel. I mean, how real is that risk? How significant is the danger of that? It seems to me that given the deterioration we've seen in relations within ECOWAS with these states, the risk of that is only going to go up.
Well, there's always the danger, which we've seen in West Africa previously, of proxy wars, and kind of destabilizing. I mean, I just think with the jihadist problems and kind of, so I think that there's a lot on the plate of a junta in Mali and in Burkina Faso to really be seriously trying to destabilize, a bigger state further south, for example, or Niger. I mean, pick a fight with Nigeria would be a really wrong move for the Niamey regime to be kind of supporting, an armed group in Nigeria. But the coastal states are concerned. There were a number of initiatives. The G5 Sahel was an attempt by Mauritania, encouraged by France, to kind of deal with the Sahelian problem, but it excluded key countries like Senegal, for example. You've had Nana Akufo-Addo launching something called the Accra Initiative, but that excluded Nigeria. And so what I do think we're now seeing is at least, some better cooperation of intelligence by countries like Togo with Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and a recognition that more development needed to be put into the far north. And so, working on how to kind of win hearts and minds, create early intelligence, try and provide resilience for when, radicalized individuals come into the north, which we've seen. There have been incidents in Benin. Togo is vulnerable. Ghana is worried about this. And in fact, Cote d'Ivoire has had, jihadist attacks historically, right in the south, in, the kind of resort area of Grand Bassam. So they are concerned, but I'm a bit hopeful here that actually militaries have trained. There are various initiatives that are actually improving security. And, sometimes the media just stereotypes things too much. And so where quiet progress is being made, people don't really talk about it. And I do think that's one of the things that is going on in the north of these countries, which is actually a reason for hope. There's actually some indications that Senegal also internally is improving its security. And it's not ECOWAS, but it is tied to this conversation. Mauritania has handled its security domestic issues in a more effective way than the other countries. And they have an election this year, Lanray, and I think there are some lessons to learn from Mauritania, is my conclusion.
How concerning is the geopolitical picture here? We all kind of know that there are camps emerging in global affairs. There's no shortage of great power competition that is now once again, it's returning with a vengeance to world affairs. And West Africa, the Sahel, it looks like it could be one of the fronts in that. We saw that around the falling out with France and Niger last year. You've already referenced that there's a growing Russian military influence and presence in the region. Obviously, that stands in opposition to that. You have, as you mentioned, the U.S. Secretary of State visiting West Africa. Great power competition returning to the region. Surely that can't be a good thing.
Well, in the end, this is where African leaders need to, decide what they want. Yes. So actually, my view is that yes, there is global competition, but there is also greater assertiveness of African and global South or global majority voice. And so there's opportunity here. My big worry on the Russians isn't what their, new version of Wagner will provide. I mean, they kind of, they can provide Praetorian Guard services, but they're not, they're shown not to be effective at stabilizing, kind of areas. But the bit that Russia's very active in is kind of trolling, misinformation, stirring division. And when I was in Ghana late last year, talking to Ghanaian authorities, that was their biggest concern was, all this fake or half fake information that is being kind of pushed through. I mean, I had people, showing me, oh, look, Wagner's arrived in Niamey. Look at all of this. And I'm like, that's not Niamey Airport. I've been there. That's Bamako. And yet it was portrayed as Niamey. And that's just one example. And then, all the flags that are being flown, in demonstrations in Niamey, And some of the Western press was saying, you know, Russian flags have been flown in from Moscow. Well, no, local tailors made these things. And actually, if you counted them, there were as many Cuban and North Korean and other flags. It was an anti-West statement. It wasn't a pro-Russia one. And so we've got to be careful at how we read some of this stuff.
Yeah, and look, I like the point that you make around the growing assertiveness of the global South, and within that, African states as well. And I would,
global majority, 80% of the world is.
Yeah, I'm glad you corrected me on that. Actually, I think that is the more accurate.
And the world is changing. And you know, if you're in Oslo or Bergen or Stavanger or London, you need to understand that. You know.
Well, we're on the same page there, and I do agree that the global majority is it's a more accurate description of what we're seeing, and within that, there is a sense that there is more room for African states to actually, you know, make substantive decisions and define where they fit into this picture, which is in many ways a potentially quite huge opportunity for not just the West Africa region, but Africa as a whole, to kind of take ownership of the geopolitics, take ownership of the economics of this.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, and so you're going to have a lot more suitors. And the thing from the difference between the Cold War and now is, you know, there was the West and the Soviet bloc. And now you've got multiple different configurations of this thing. You've got the Gulf states, you've got India, you've got Turkey, you know, and so there's a lot more choice. And so we are in this era of a la cartism, but you do need collectivism, you know, so will need in my view, a common ECOWAS view, you know, and so a bit of it is, of course, Nigeria first or Cote d'Ivoire first or Senegal first, but it's also where is there, you know, collective advantage at negotiating on this and sharing notes and information sharing and intelligence sharing.
You have to forgive the plug here, but we're of course going to be having exactly this conversation in Oslo at the end of April, where we're hosting the Africa Outlook, and we're looking forward to having you there, Alex. It'll be interesting to pick up that conversation there. But let's wrap things up here for now. A significant announcement, I would say, regardless of how you slice it. But I think the overarching message, and I would tend to agree with you here, is that there's obviously strong political dimension to this, and I guess we'll have to see in the coming months how this plays out and exactly what the fallout from this is.
Lanre, I agree. The words that come to my mind is "don't panic." You know.
Okay. I think that's a good note to end on. Don't panic, and let's see how it goes. Anyway, thanks so much, Alex, for the time, and thanks for the insight and analysis.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.